what inspired you to write this book, and why are NFTs the everything token?
I'll kind of hit
Go ahead.
the first part, and then I'll pass to Scott for the second part. I think for us, like, so you mentioned we co-authored the first Harvard Business Review article about NFTs, and when we did that, we had this great acclaim from the NFT community because, you know, it's Harvard Business Review article, right? It's something that for me, you know, when I was at Progressive and Nestle, obviously, like, that was the thing we used in like trainings, right? To say like, this is something that is an expert opinion that we're working off of. But what was really cool is beyond the Web3 community, we found that people were saying to us and others, this is the first piece of information I've seen that makes me realize that these aren't expensive monkey JPEGs on the internet. There's maybe something more here. And so I think with Scott and I, we started seeing like that reaction and thinking, okay, this is pretty good. Like, how do we scale this? And concurrently, we found ourselves getting a lot of the same questions from people we'd be, you know, consulting with and discussing this with who are outside of the Web3 world. And we realized that the best way to scale out the answers to these questions, explain this technology, and sort of help people who haven't been paying attention the whole time and make them understand that this is a powerful general purpose technology. And frankly, the next iteration of the internet was for us to write a book about it and get it out there. So we connected with Penguin Publishing, Penguin Portfolio. Scott knew an editor there. And the inspiration was, how can we get this out to as many people as possible? Because our goal is just to share the ideas and hope that we can help move the sort of adoption curve of the technology, maybe just a little bit. If, you know, somebody reads this and understands it a little better, and then I'll throw to Scott in a sec, but like a quick, very, you know, story that gives me goosebumps that's worth telling about it is I was on a podcast from someone. We had gotten these pre-copies of the book, but before it went public and you could buy it. And, you know, the person had said, hey, my dad's tech savvy, a person in their 40s. They said, but, you know, he reads, you know, he plays chess with me in the Oculus, but he just doesn't get NFTs. And I said, well, let me send him a signed book and maybe we'll change his mind. And he had sent me a message later on that said, you know, my dad sent me a text. He said, I'm 9 pages in and I'm starting to understand what this stuff is about. I'm a couple chapters in later. And he said he had set up a wallet. And then a few chapters still later, he had purchased his first NFT. And so the idea that his dad could go from skeptical, who he laughed because he's like, I've been trying to convince this guy for 3 years to do this. And he now is like in this world understanding it, is exactly why we wrote this. So that was the sort of inspiration. And hearing those stories is better than like sort of any sales number or anything else we hear. But I'll pass to Scott more on the everything token story itself.
Awesome. The yes, and then the evolution, right? I'm seeing in the chat, you know, sort of after he read the book, he started his own NFT project. But seriously, there actually have been people who've reached out to us and said that they've like started, and indeed, there's even someone who's publicly like building like a digital, you know, an NFT based coffee brand, and has been very public about it. He's like trying to use all the principles from the book explicitly as he thinks through how to build this, which has just been incredibly gratifying and really exciting. The one more point maybe on the sort of the inspiration that exactly what Steve was just referencing. One thing that when we talk to our, you know, our editor and more broadly, like people at the publisher, something that they expressed really strongly was that it was important for us to think about writing for the late adopters, right? Part of this is just because book publishing is slow, right? If you start writing a book in like, you know, 2022, it comes out in 2024. But part of it was also because most of the audience, right? Like sort of one primary audience was to help, you know, sort of to help Web3 builders do better and sort of like try and crystallize a lot of what we have found so exciting about NFT space and help people who are very excited about it already, like appreciate it even more and like maybe give some like words and language and structure to their excitement. But that entire, even if we like hit that entire market, right? Like even if we like managed to do that successfully for the entirety of the current people in Web3, the real, like, you know, so to move the technology forward, it's also really important to be able to speak to the vast majority of people, you know, sort of like, you know, or rather the people outside that, you know, who are not in Web3 might be very confused or frustrated or off put by these technologies, and help them understand like what it is and like why, you know, sort of, you know, why Web3 and like why NFTs are sort of a fundamental enabler for a new paradigm of the internet. So towards this question of like, why are NFTs the everything token? Fundamentally, and a major thesis of the book is that NFTs are an incredibly simple yet extremely general purpose technology, right? The idea of a digital record of owner that represents ownership and embedded in that story, mostly people on this call already sort of said they're into Web3 in some capacity, but let me just quickly, like, you know, even so, just frame the primitive of you can own, like the design primitive of you as an individual own a single account that has all of these like digital ownership records in it. You control an account that you can then move flexibly from platform to platform, restores the sense of ownership that we're used to with physical goods in many ways, right? One, you control how an asset you own is used, right? Like, if you have cards for, you have Pokemon cards and you want to play a game with them, you can take them from one place to another and play a game with your friends, and you don't even have to necessarily play the Pokemon game by the rules, right? You can play like, some other game like a match color or like Uno. Fun fact, you can actually play Pokemon Uno, like using the original Pokemon cards. We did once try this. But like, critically, it's like you have this physical asset and you can use that asset interoperably across different situations, and you can sort of personally like sort of innovate on it and experience it in different ways. That sort of, uniqueness of ownership, or this like functional ownership, has actually been absent from digital goods prior to NFTs. And, for good reason in some sense, which is that digital goods, sort of as they've existed, right? Images on your computer or media files, they're, the act of sharing them with someone is in effect an act of copying them, right? You're sort of, if I'm a digital artist and I want to like send you an image that you're going to consider purchasing, or I took a photo and like maybe you're going to like use, license it to use in some news article. If I send you the image, I've just given it to you, right? And like there's intellectual property, there's sort of law that like, sort of that facilitates, some degree of market exchange nonetheless. But fundamentally, it's really hard to define an ownership right over a digital good. NFTs, by sort of leveraging this paradigm of like, there are digital accounts, wallets, that are the owners of these digital assets, and that can be uniquely defined and verified by anyone. And if I move, I have an NFT saying I own an image, or an NFT saying I own a ticket. If I send it to Steve, it can now be verified that this asset has been transferred, just as if I gifted him a Pokemon card or a physical ticket. That unlocks lots of new types of market designs by making it possible to have markets in digital goods, and potentially even markets in, sort of more efficient representations of, digital representations of physical goods, right? And then, so first of all, it's just, this is an incredibly general purpose technology for defining ownership. But then, as we discuss in the book, and as many of you sort of in your own like sort of experience in NFT space have probably felt, because these are digital records embedded in software, you can build value on top of them in incredibly flexible ways, right? Like, an NFT that confers ownership in the seat to, like, the right to attend an event, like a digital ticket, can later become, in and of itself, a brand anchor, right? The asset persists. You have this, like, you've attended the game, you have this ticket stub, if you will, digital ticket stub. And now maybe the team that you attended the sports event. Sorry, Steve's going to do much better sporting metaphors than I do, but this one I think I'll try and handle. You've attended a sporting event, and the team later wants to give you a thing. They can like, in effect, like direct deposit a coupon or access to physical merchandise, or maybe some local newspaper wants to give anyone who's like been seeing these games the right to view the articles about them. And so now you go to a newspaper's website. This is totally third party, no interaction with the team. They just add the functionality that if you have a ticket to the game, you can connect your digital wallet. They verify you have that ticket, and now you can read the coverage. And so there's this, whoa, there's a POAP for this event. Let's go. Everyone's like frantically claiming the POAP. Amazing. Okay, so don't like all be distracted and claim the POAP right now, but this is awesome. Digital collectible for the event. I love it. And indeed, right? Like, we're giving, you guys are giving out a digital collectible at this event. That could become the beginnings of a network, right? That surfaces a connection between all the people who are here. And we can later, like, log onto a platform like Farcaster potentially and create like a token gated group chat gated by that event, POAP, that event representation. And so now we have a way to connect with each other. And this feeds into the idea of the NFT staircase, which is sort of the sort of core framework of the book. And maybe I should pause and let there be more questions, because I saw a huge one appeared in the chat, but I'm sure we'll talk about these like different layers of value soon. Okay.
Yeah,
Question
Evan,
is, Evan, you want to shout it out, or should we
Sure.
read it?
Sorry. Yeah, I can read it off.
Go for it.
I've pushed NFTs and like spent a lot of time thinking about what the future could or should be like. I think that like one thing I would add to your description of NFTs, like, yes, it does all of those things and it does so permissionlessly, which I think is much more interesting. I think most of those capabilities could be done in a permission way that is much easier to regulate. As a result, when you do it permissionlessly, it gets much easier to have things like speculation on. And I think that speculation is has been found to be the killer app for a lot of these things. It is technologically easier and it is financially more profitable than actually building useful things. The useful things are kind of a pain to use, and it's not as fun or engaging for most of the earliest adopters. And I'm convinced that in the future we're going to have with very high likelihood we will have blockchain-based permissioning, digital twinning, all of the things, especially as we move into augmented reality stuff and distributed file system storage. Makes more sense because you care about digital things that are linked to physical locations. The challenge is, of course, how do we get over the fact that speculation seems to frequently suck all the money out of the room and draw in all of the attention? Is there something that either of you or both of you have thought of as yeah, when we look back on what got us there, it's going to have been Apple investing in this standard, or Meta and Apple deciding to use a shared standard for a thing, or some sports related product? There obviously has to be enough funding to move technology, or is it just having a very broad portfolio approach through very large investment funds that push technology at the smallest scale? I spent a little bit of time thinking about what this could look like and how to make it move faster. I think communication in books is a really good direction, but I'd be curious if there's something on the technology level or the economic level that you've had thought of.
Steve, do you want to start or should I?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I have a couple of thoughts on this, because I think there's a couple different parts of this question, right? On one end, you're talking about the motivation to the end user to engage with NFTs. And on the other end, you have the motivation of the company that is issuing them, right? And so both of those being aligned, if a company is issuing an NFT and their primary sort of metric is secondary sales volume or floor pricing or things like that, which also appeals to a financialized user. I think what's interesting is on the company side, at least my general thought on motivation is that, somebody's going to build Squarespace for creating loyalty programs, and they're going to make a tremendous amount of money. And that's going to be a motivator on the company side. I think on the consumer side, it almost becomes a thing of when the NFTs are faded into the background. By the way, it's a tremendous question. But I think it's almost a thing when the NFTs are faded into the background, right? When I'm using it as a ticket, but I don't know it's a ticket. When my 68-year-old, mother is using Starbucks Odyssey and getting a loyalty reward, but doesn't know it's an NFT. When my travel app issues me effectively a POAP type thing when I land in New York, so I know exactly when I took that trip and I can remember that and tag memories to it. So to me, on both ends of it, there is a market aspect to it. Certainly, I mean, even within current Starbucks Odyssey, there is a secondary market, right? And so things happen there. But I think, to me, on the two answers to the question I look at, and Scott will probably have a more eloquent answer than me, it's on one end, you have the motivation on the company side, and that is building things where the motivation or large companies issue them, and they can have a motivation of they don't want to speculate on floor price. They don't want to get in that sort of trouble, number one. But, when Dot Swoosh is able to say we provide a better consumer experience because our top fans are able to get through and buy sneakers without getting botted, that becomes a motivation for them to sort of, work through that, right? And then on the other end of it, on the consumer end, you have a better experience. So to me, it's solved as the technology advances, because we've seen this early on before, with .com booms and other things. And I think what you look at is the app craze, right? Where it was I was paying $1.99 so I could have a fake beer I chugged on my phone because that was the use of the app and the iPhone at the time. Of course, apps now advance and have multiple use cases. So to me, it's the structures and incentive structures become different when you provide a real value to someone's life using the technology and they realize, oh, like Scott mentioned, ticketing is a strictly better technology. So they're just using NFTs, but much like the term MP3, when they fade into the background and I'm just getting a ticket or a loyalty reward or whatever it is, to me, that's what it changed on the consumer side. And on the business side, it's, there's just going to be motivations to integrate a better technology solution that solves problems for them and interconnects a lot of things. But I'll be curious to hear Scott's answer on this one as well.
No, I definitely agree with that. And in particular, I mean, I think of the current market, we were saying in the book, right? That's sort of like, the NFT market at the time we were writing, and in many senses to today, although this is, I think, starting to shift, has had like a very immature market feel to it in the same way the early .com did, right? It's sort of like a lot of exploration, a lot of experimentation, and the business models weren't, the workable business models weren't clear, right? It was like all new discovery. It was sort of, and a lot of these, and a lot of these projects like were just sort of fundamentally unsustainable, but there wasn't necessarily something, it wasn't like, intentional on the team's part. It's just like they didn't sort of, the business models weren't clear and people hadn't figured out like what the real opportunities were. And the other thing that's very out of equilibrium, right? Like crypto as a space has been very over financialized, and you say, well, that looks like a killer app. Like, it hasn't been a killer app for the broader population, right? Like sort of there's not a tremendous draw. Like, the financialization of crypto has been around, basically since its inception, right? It started as a technology for, sort of managing like ledger transactions fundamentally. And yet that has not, in fact, been a thing that crossed the chasm broadly, even to the extent that it's gained sort of like mainstream public attention and to some degree, acceptance for it. But whereas, a lot of these like almost more mundane applications, right? Like, the ability to have like a much more efficient market in tickets, simple digital collectibles, not the sort of like, $1,000 like NFTs or whatever, sort of like NFT, like sort of fine art pieces or whatever, but much more like your digital Pokemon cards or your like, stamps commemorating going to a national park or something, right? People literally buy like physical stamp books to collect their national park stamps. You can imagine a digital twin of that could be like very, very additive, for the user. So much of our lives and what we share online is, what we share with our friends and whatever is online and digital. And meanwhile, for the parks, they would love to be able to see who's collecting these stamps and how to interact with them and so forth. Like a lot of these things are going to sort of, sort of, again, like, the future, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't have a way to predict this. But I suspect that as the market moves towards like broader consumer awareness, and acceptance, it's going to be through these applications that are very far from the speculative sort of category, right? It's going to be much more like basic, infrastructure and functionality. And then, to the extent like collectibles is a huge market globally, like it was sort of physical, like not even like the digital collectibles component, just like collectibles is a multi-$100 billion market. You can imagine very naturally a digital category that lives in that space based around NFTs, but it's, the most of the collectibles market is things that sell for $1 or $2. And I guess maybe one other footnote on that is that, we've been talking a lot about markets in the sense of, and transferable NFTs, like things that people exchange, but like even that is its own, is only a subset of what people do and will use. And like, there's a whole different set of applications that come with non-transferable NFTs. It's identity or reputation records, sort of credentials for online courses, or we're getting more and more questions about, proof of identity, like an interoperable cross-platform proof of identity in a world with AI fakes. That might be like a very compelling use case that onboards lots of people to the tech. And what's special about Web3 is the second you've taken part in any of this, you've got your NF ticket, you've got your AI like certifying like, nope, this is really me posting on Twitter today button. Like these things are interoperable, and you establish a wallet, you establish a personal account to start using them. And so from there, you can enter into the ecosystem and start using the other consumer applications in a way that actually we didn't really have with the Web2 consumer apps, where when you join, you don't sort of instantaneously gain access to everything else. So there's another question in the chat. Nike, Starbucks. Yes, go for it.
Yeah, I guess, and I love where the conversation thread is going, because for me, my robust analysis is that a lot of these use cases that are actually eloquent use cases, right? Because usually there's the whole like, well, what's a Web3 use case? And like nobody could come up with something. But then when you talk about like Nike and Starbucks, and like, okay, these are things that are proving to be popular, and to Steve's point, are proven to provide a better user experience abstracted away from the technology. So I think my broader question is, it seems to me like the value of NFTs is being propelled by quote unquote centralized entities, right? Brands And if that's the case, would that not lend to thinking about the adoption of NFTs as a whole being better served through centralized organizations that provide order, predictability, protection, versus I think that the current path, or the path, from the last few years, which is like decentralized, the Wild West, figure it out, buy your own risk. Because it seems to me like that's what's actually going to create the quote unquote positive relationship with NFTs, and then the decentralization could come later. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, I have a couple thoughts on it. I think one, actually, so interesting about Starbucks, you can take self-custody of your stamps and still get all the credit for them. So there is a decentralized nature that where someone can pull it into, say, their MetaMask and keep it out there. But I think what's interesting is I think it's going to depend on the application. So to me, it's like, if you have a teaching degree in a country of unrest and you want to bring that to a new one because you're leaving because of something you're worried about, or money or things like that, in a non-strong monetary system, the decentralization nature there is obviously very important to somebody who is going cross borders, place to place. But like, I actually think, the same way, like, I like to keep my money in banks. There is something I know that, isn't always popular in the crypto space, but I do. Having a sort of entity that is custodial is something I think a lot of people are going to want. Now, not everybody can. So that's why I'm a big proponent of options, and why I'm really glad Starbucks went the extra step to make it so people can take it off platform, because people do. I think some of them will be centralized. I think some of them will be decentralized. I think the important thing is, to me, and this is just my personal opinion, is the open ledger is advantageous to the brands in the sense that you want people building third-party utility on top of your brand, right? Like, if you're Starbucks or if you're Nike, let's use Nike as an example, and someone's coming out with a new fresh apparel group, right? A new fresh apparel line, and they want somebody to be able to get a discount who they know is a qualified Nike customer. Well, you could give discounts based on the amount of .swoosh boxes they own and say, if you have a dozen, you get this discount. And if you have 20, you get this discount, right? And for Nike, that's awesome, because it means somebody else is doing your job for you. They are providing the utility. In a lot of ways, it's, to go deep into the NFT world, like, recently, the brand Pudgy Penguins, which has a tremendous presence, that they're building in Walmart and other places like that, they received an airdrop from, a company called, or a brand DYM, right? And people received, some of them, thousands of dollars, and Pudgy Penguin didn't have to do anything. But guess what? It rose demand for people having Pudgy Penguins. On a smaller scale and a more realistic one, I think in the, traditional markets, like, if Nike has people saying, I have an apparel brand and you can get a free hat by connecting it if you own 25 .swoosh boxes, people might buy more .swoosh boxes. They might, jump into that and do it. So to me, I think it's sort of a yes and in this particular situation, where it's like, one, like, the ability to have, third party performed on top of it is good. But two, like, I actually think a lot of people are open to custodial options, and the majority of people don't necessarily want to remember a 23rd word phrase that if they forget, like, we were talking to someone yesterday who was saying, like, they got their ledger in the mail and it basically said, if you forget your seed phrase, may God have mercy on your soul. And I think that that's sort of the idea. And obviously it was a little hyperbole, but it's the idea of, like, a lot of people are very open to a custodial option. Like, again, I and it's funny because you can get both ends of the coin on this one. I have money on Coinbase. I like having the custodial option to stake certain things. On the flip side, a lot of people went to Coinbase yesterday and they're having errors and it said they had $0. And they're like, okay, well, this shows decentralization matters. But, like, I think it can go both ways. But my feeling is most people actually really like having a custodial option. But on a personal level, I like having both options. And I think having an open programmable ledger is super important for a brand to be able to get extra utility. And I don't know, Scott, if you have a different thought on that.
No, I totally agree. Like, and just maybe just one build on top of it, thinking about the examples of Starbucks and Nike and so forth, right? They, they're leveraging this technology to sort of give a more decentralized access to the brand, if you will, while themselves still being like centralized entities. And in fact, lots of digital brands are that, right? Like, lots of the NFT native brands are also, sort of a centralized company, right? Like, they are a company that, like, manufactures the product and sort of guides sort of like overall direction for the brand. And yet they're also allowing, like, decentralized value creation. And by giving people, sort of digital assets, again, that live on an interoperable, sort of ledger system, then then people can make use of those assets in lots of ways without having to necessarily interface with the brand. It's not like Starbucks has to like open up the API for their rewards programs to enable people to display their reward badges on other platforms. Those people just have those reward badges. They're on a blockchain. The platform can reference them and display them. And certainly, like, if you're a third party, right, you're just like, Steve's example of, you're trying to do an apparel drop and you want to give it to people who have bought a lot of Nike because you know that that's like the type of customer you want to advertise to. You don't have to interface with Nike, get API access to their customer database or something of the sort. Even if Nike would love to have that happen, right, that the overhead for that is like way too difficult for most companies. And certainly think for like a local business or something, incredibly complicated. But the fact this stuff all lives on a public interoperable standard means that, blockchains and NFT standards within blockchains means that third parties can add on value just directly without having to interface with the original brand.
So along those lines, actually, can either of you explain what a vampire attack is and like what your thoughts on this are, like whether or not this is actually
Sure. Absolutely. So one core principle, right? Sort of a feature of this Web3 model where each individual has their own personal wallet that they can move from platform to platform and sort of like transfer their assets interoperably without having to like, if you think about it, like if you want to take your assets out of a bank or some other like custody system, like it's actually very complicated for good reason, by the way. Like it should be, there are lots of reasons why, you want to go through a lot of processes before you remove all of your assets from a bank, right? They want to, I am not a lawyer. I am not an expert in financial security, but there are definitely lots of reasons you want to make sure that people are who they are and so forth. But like if you think about it, if you want to take your assets, your digital assets out of Facebook, it's not just hard, it's actually effectively impossible. So like Facebook will let you, take all of the content you've created and like export like copies of it in some form. They sort of live in these, JSONs and other sort of like Facebook internal sort of like, sort of relevant formats. And there's no real way to like take that content and just like load it into some other platform, much less have it be sort of functional on two platforms at once, right? Like your reputation on Facebook sort of interoperates with your reputation on Instagram because these are both meta properties, but like there's no way to make it interoperate with your reputation on LinkedIn, even though there is information on both that would be cross-relevant. Web3, everything you've created and all of the digital assets you own is attached to a single master account that you can move from platform to platform. And this enables a new type of competitive strategy called a vampire attack, where a platform in effect says, look, I want to recruit all the users of my competitors. I know who they are because I can look at the blockchain ledger and figure out who they are. And I want to just, I just need to incentivize them to switch over somehow, whether it's by creating better features or like giving them, some sort of like highly elevated status. I basically say, look, if you can prove that you're a principal customer of my competitor, I'm going to give you bonus status here. And in Web3, because people's identities are portable, they can just port over. And we've seen this play out in several contexts where platforms have, directly launched with sort of, incentives for competitors to switch. And again, early days, it's not totally clear how stable and sustainable the strategies that have been used to do this so far are. But, definitely we've seen that this ability of users to just like vote with their feet is a very sort of powerful, force for competition. And maybe one footnote, by the way, this isn't totally new to Web3, right? Actually, like airlines have had status match going back, sort of forever, where if you can say, if you're a United, like, sort of platinum member and you want to switch to Delta, I forget what the status correspondence is, but, if you can prove you can like verify to Delta that you have this United status, Delta will often be willing to give you the equivalent Delta status, maybe with some condition that you have to fly a certain amount in a certain period of time to maintain it. But for exactly the same reason, right? That like a really good United customer is likely to also be a very good Delta customer. And so Delta has a lot to gain by convincing United customers to switch. The difference is that Web3 makes this totally frictionless, right? There's no like, printing out information to document that you have, that you in fact were a United customer and like, sort of shipping, like that, probably faxing it. I have no idea how you do this these days. You probably have to like fax it to Delta and then some human has to review it. Here, literally, like, a new competitor can look at the blockchain and say, oh, you've done a bunch of transactions with the incumbent. I will just reward you right now if you switch. And so it becomes much lower friction to do these types of status match attacks.
Can I just to build on that, just like a couple of things that I think like, because I have probably a controversial or unique perspective on vampire attacks. Well, number one, the non-controversial thing is obviously the product has to be good, right? It's like we've seen situations now many times where particularly, non-custodial or non-custodial wallets have said, use our wallet, earn this thing. And then 3 weeks later, it's like, nobody's using this wallet. I won't name names, but I have had that happen before. Likewise, we've seen it more successfully, or at least attempted, with certain marketplaces where the value proposition is different, right? Like we've seen this with, Blur, OpenSea, Magic Eden. There's a whole circular economy going there to try to get people to go out of their normal status. So like the product has to deliver. But one of the things I think is interesting about it is ultimately, like, I think making vampire attacks more seamless could be good for businesses because it empowers the consumer and it forces innovation and it forces you to be better, because that's like, and like it's sometimes I say this and people are like, vampire attacks, because of the nature of like, it almost sounds like a pejorative phrase where you're like, oh, vampire attacks, it's bad, right? But like, I actually would argue
it is a little strange to say what we need is more vampires, right? Like,
it certainly doesn't seem right on paper, but like, I actually think somebody saying you connect to our site and we're going to give you this X, Y, and Z, and they offer a better product. Well, the people who are getting their, sort of lunch eaten need to then go back and say, why are we getting our lunch eaten? How can we improve? And I think you can see it go both ways, like similarly. So it's like, A, if the product doesn't deliver, I'm right back over. In fact, I can say like I've switched from one wallet to another in the past, and then I've ultimately chose to stay with my initial wallet that I'm using for multiple purposes because it works better. And that's not to say I'll never switch, but the product didn't deliver. But if it did, well, then my previous wallet would probably say, we can do this better and you're comfortable with us, and here's why we are a better product. So I actually think it kind of breeds innovation, and it gets almost a bad rap. And it's usually not a popular take because people are like, well, no, people are poaching, customers. But isn't that what we're all doing with advertising, generally speaking? When you get someone to try, if Dunkin' Donuts tells me they can make a better coffee than Starbucks, I'm going to try it. If it's good, Starbucks is going to have to find a way to keep me as a customer. So it makes your customers have to deepen that. And last thing I'll build on it is it almost accentuates the need for people to deepen their loyalty programs to be more than just product. Because like the reason why I'll continue to do Starbucks, as a side note, if Dunkin' tries a vampire attack, is even if I think the product is good, I have loyalty program that is ingrained in there that has deepened my relationship with the brand, where I take in virtual coffee farms. I've gone to their roasteries through different missions and things. And so it actually makes me, the same way that like, you might not switch your favorites. Like someone could tell you if you were a Kansas City Chiefs, or bad example, they're winning. Okay, I'm a Cleveland Browns fan. If somebody says to me, I want you to be a Cincinnati Bengals fan tomorrow, like they're trying to vampire
I'm
attack my fandom.
And I'm going to give you like, a free t-shirt.
Right. It makes it so that, but that, because I have an emotional connection with that brand, it's going to take a lot more in the free. Now, if like one of the convincing things that they did as a side note, and then I'll kind of like get off the example, is like, my friend, Sean happens to be friends with people on the Cincinnati Bengals, and seeing Sam Hubbard, an Ohio State Buckeye who plays for the Bengals, follow me on X was a strong motivator to say, maybe I do like this team a little bit more, right? That's a funny play that he did. But like, you need to offer bigger incentives. It's like, if I suddenly become best friends with Joe Burrow, the quarterback, well, then that's an incentive. But the incentives have to be increasingly large if you have increased your loyalty and your emotional connection with the brand. So, that's kind of my take on it.
Do you think that there'd ever be like a cultural norm that might develop against starting a vampire attack, right? It's like if you yourself could be vulnerable to an attack in the future, you're not going to do it to somebody else.
I like the ceasefire idea of like everybody just chill, right? It's like, but like I don't know. Scott, like, you think market design more than me, so you're probably more equipped, but I don't think that would happen because I just don't think, because it's just going to take, it's like a ceasefire is only as good as one side, right? And so like, I think like it could be, but if like one brand does it, like I think the next brand will then say, well, we have to reply to this. And so I find that it probably not, but it's actually an interesting question. Scott, I'm curious your take on that with more market design thoughts.
I mean, first of all, I have no opinion on the antitrust sort of component of this. Like there are sort of long and there's a long and like very like historic and like sort of carefully thought through economics research literature and applied like antitrust practitioner literature on how you think about what are called coordinated effects, forms of tacit collusion, whereby firms agree to like not like, sort of lower prices, somehow like coordinate without directly interacting on like not lowering prices or something of the sort. So there's a whole separate question of that. It's like, what are the circumstances, which I'm not an expert in, but I'm just flagging if anybody's like really curious about that. There's a massive antitrust literature that sort of thinks through this question of like when those types of equilibria can be sustained. But from a platform competition perspective specifically, I think even in a universe in which, sort of maybe these like very flashy like vampire attacks sort of aren't the first order thing, right? It's sort of, but again, by the way, one particular context we've seen these in most commonly so far has been newly entering platforms, right? And like if you're an entrant about to compete against an established incumbent, you have a strong incentive to try and like, sort of leverage their customer base to the extent that you can. And it's not clear, like if you're launching your platform, right, you're not part of the whatever industry exists in the industry equilibrium exists so far. But I think even in a universe where like, there's not like very like active and sort of like almost like gamesmanship type like competition for customers, the possibility of like lowered switching costs and easier multi-homing, we've always known, reduces the extent to which a market becomes winner take all. And in a context like this in particular, we would expect to drive competition on features and platform quality, right? Like really what you hope is that the ability of users to move from platform to platform isn't, sort of about having users just constantly like moving from platform to platform, but rather when a platform introduces some new feature that people really want, they have the ability to go and utilize that. And that drives platforms to launch better features and like introduce new benefits that, for the consumer. And so I think that type of competition, at least the hope, should be much more robust in Web3 because the switching costs are so much lower.
I think we had a question.
Yeah.
Yep.
For Josh, maybe?
So I think like in the Web3 space, communities or companies are built more altruistically with the intention to share power with the users, share ownership. But in Web2, companies are built as walled gardens to essentially like own and monetize the data that their users generate. And so if, companies were to create these loyalty programs or create, ways for like create sort of NFT programs or portable data portability, wouldn't it be in their best interest to introduce as much friction as possible for their competitor? And by going on chain or by making their data portable, what's the sort of outsized upside effect that they have?
Great. So this is a great question. And we get versions of it frequently. And again, the jury, at some level, the jury is still out because this is early days for Web3 and we have to see how it plays out. But let me give at least two examples and then that hopefully will illustrate that there's a potential for this to be much more powerful at scale, right? So one thing is, digital ownership, at least the way I like to talk about it, is in some sense is about growing, like incentivizing all of your users or, sort of, and we talk in the book about sort of, forming identity and community around digital assets, like getting your users or customers to think of themselves not just as like customers of your product, but actually like part of the brand. Steve, that's Steve language, right? Like in Web 1, you're the consumer. In Web 2, you're the product. And in Web 3, you're a part of the brand. Like, and incentivizing people through ownership and through their like own sense of like identity and personal attachment to the brand, to a platform, to a company, like whatever, to actually build value on top of it that drives up the size of the total pie. And so in effect, you might like, you might in the end, because you've shared out ownership among many different people, you sort of distributed like the ownership of your platform in a sense. Like the platform may claim a smaller proportional slice, but of a massively larger pie. And so, on the one hand, right, like just at its core, if users are selecting into your platform because they want to use it and like promoting it to their friends and sort of like, trying to drive more and more value, building extensions and new like apps on top of it. Like we've seen a lot of innovation in the last several weeks on the Farcaster protocol. Farcaster is a decentralized social media protocol. And, it's been kind of magical, right? They introduced a new feature that lets you essentially like run an application inside a post. So like it's as if you could like play a game inside of a tweet or something. And you know, a week after they launched this, many people had like created their own versions of it. Like some people are literally like building businesses on top of applications that flow through these posts and so forth. And a lot of that drives value back to the underlying protocol, right? It sort of enhances the capabilities of your system. And because people feel like, you know, sort of the protocol is, the protocol is decentralized and safe, thus, you know, safe to innovate on. They're not going to like lose access, you know, have an API cut off or something like that. They then feel empowered to build on it in a way that actually drives more value to the protocol as a whole. So we may see, like, first of all, just this like concept of Web3 as enabling enabling and incentivizing a bigger pie. Like, at least my hope is that we're going to see that play out. But then the other one specifically, you've asked about interoperating assets. Like, what's people's incentive to like let something out of their platform and go elsewhere? And in the Web3 model, it's like definitely hard to see that, right? Because like the business model, sorry, the Web2 model, it's very hard to see that because the business model of Web2 has been built around these, you know, sort of network effects at the level of the platform, where you lock in as much data as possible to like sort of make the center of gravity for the users as tight as possible, to drive up the amount of data you have to like reinforce this network effect. And that's the business model. But in Web3, there are still network effects, but they accrue at the level of the asset. And that, for many applications, could be potentially much more powerful. So if you think about it, you're like a digital game. Like people ask me, like, why might like Epic or like some major game studio ever let the assets out of their game, right? Like it's sort of surreal, right? Like, you know, they want people spending as much time in their game as possible. And it's like, oh yeah, sure, absolutely. They want people to spend time in their game, but those people do lots of other stuff on the internet, right? Like, you know, they might, you know, they might, like, first of all, just like have a Zoom background or something. Wouldn't it be cool if the Zoom background could feature like the verified picture of their character with like, you know, the really awesome sword that they just got? And now your Zoom background becomes a walking advertisement, right? Like, you know, I would literally be advertising your game in this call right now just because I had this cool picture that, you know, Zoom acquired by reference to the NFT associated with the game. Similarly, by the way, if you go to other games, right? Like, you know, why should like Fortnite skins be able to be portable into other games? Well, you know, the more places you can show off your Fortnite skin, the more value there is to having a Fortnite skin. And a lot of that value accrues back to Fortnite, which is the big, you know, the big platform, sort of the one that is the incumbent. And so it basically, like, Fortnite spends money on advertising. This turns your users into organic advertisers. And what's the cost? The cost is that like you've enabled the users to advertise sort of the platform in a like free and sort of whatever manner that they want, you know, modular their usage, and you can still have usage rules and things on top of that, by the way. But then also, like, even beyond the just sort of like direct use of the assets for advertising, there's contexts like these third party utility add-ons, right? Like maybe Steve, actually, you want to talk about Hot Pockets?
You like, this is like the finishing each other's sentences thing, because I actually had a note, third party utility Hot Pockets, and then the one other piece that I would add to this, which is, to your point, like on paper, it doesn't make sense that Hot Pockets would say, okay, like, you know, like, or it doesn't make sense that a video game would say, you can take this off the platform, we want to make it a flexible asset. But the example I would give is like, look at Hot Pockets. All sentences are into Hot Pockets. Agree, Wes, on that wholeheartedly as someone who used to work for the brand. But right now, you know, Hot Pockets, they, you know, do really expensive sort of, you know, gaming partnerships with groups like NRG. And certainly they'll continue to do that, right? But like, imagine if Fortnite has flexible assets that you could use outside of the platform that they allow to go outside of it. And they say, hey, if you bought the latest Fortnite skin, the latest whatever it is, then you can connect to the Hot Pocket site and get 20% off, because they want to target gamers, right? That is their, non-surprisingly, by the way, spoiler alert, working for Hot Pockets, they target gamers. And so if that's sort of their target audience, like, the idea that Fortnite would be able to say, people are going to buy more Fortnite skins to say, well, I can get 20% off Hot Pockets, that's awesome. And everybody wins in that scenario. And they're probably going to sell more product at the same cost they were selling that skin anyway, but the flexibility asset gives it like a little bit more movement to try to get that discount. And the other like minor point I would add to this is sort of the adjacent conversation to the concept of IP rights, because very much in a similar fashion, you know, I look at like a Bored Ape Yacht Club, which gave IP rights to people, you know, following the hash masks. They've talked about how they kind of grabbed it from them. And people would say, why would you ever give the IP rights of an asset to a holder? And some don't, right? There's more limited ones with Pudgy Penguins, yet Storm a limited one with Doodles, because they all have different strategies.
And especially with established brands where like their IP asset is sort of like, their IP is sort of like very constrained and sort of like already like sort of tightly curated. Sorry, go ahead.
For sure. And this is the traditional model. But on the other hand, the reason why Bored Ape Yacht Club is probably as popular as it is, or one of the many reasons, is because they allow Snoop Dogg to use it for his ice cream brand and on stage, and he has the ability to do that. The fact that, there's a Bored Ape on page 1 of our book as we're talking about and introing with the, kind of like we meet people where they are with the absurdity of this brand with selling digital primate pictures, getting a $4 billion valuation. Right? Like we talk about that, but guess what? There's a Bored Ape on page 1 of a book that is taught at Ivy League schools. That is good for the Bored Ape brand. So it's the same concept of like the flexibility of letting the letting go of some control of letting your assets go off platform creates a decentralized marketing opportunities. It creates opportunities for you to, potentially have third-party utility. And I always say it's an adjacent to the IP rights conversation because, people would say that's insane. Why would you ever do that? Like, that's not the Web 2 model. Wouldn't it be in their best interest to keep those IP rights? And certainly maybe they will. Like, we'll have to see how it plays out. But having seen early results of, the fact that they're ape-based, I can see, 4 ape-based products walking through a Walmart, or I see them all over people's backgrounds, or, look at my display. I have an ape right there and it's on different products. Certainly shows that there is opportunity when you release things into a more Web3 way to be successful. So I think very similar. It's an adjacent conversation, but Scott's point, the decentralized marketing agent, sort of agency that you can unleash on it, it has a lot of powerful effect that I think you'll see brands start to, utilize more and more.
Can we actually go into copyright issues a little bit now that you've brought this up? It's not the case that NFT ownership like directly maps onto what you might consider traditional copyright ownership, right? There's like a whole kind of space of different possibilities here. So can you talk a bit about like what people have done before? Like what happens if there's a lawsuit, like who is involved in the lawsuit? Do courts have any inclination to respect the NFT records, right?
So neither Steve nor I are lawyers, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to talk precisely. And then, like in particular, I don't know the case law on how on how courts have treated NFT intellectual sort of like NFT ownership as directly representative, except in one high level sense I can explain, which is that it's a great question, by the way, and all of this is evolving, right? Like new types of property rights enable new types of markets. They also like raise massive numbers of questions about what exactly the new type of property right is, how it's maintained, how it's interpreted, how it interacts with other forms of property right, like if even just like the simple question of how does one even explicitly, if your goal is to give the copyright of an asset to the person who holds an NFT associated to that digital asset, how does that actually happen? To the extent that teams have done this so far, again, I'm not a lawyer, so none of this is precise, and certainly none of this is legal advice. Teams have done this through various forms of contract, right? And terms of service, where they've explicitly said, we have a contractual, like our contract. Again, speaking loosely, like our contract with the owner of the NFT is that the person whose digital wallet controls this NFT, and is represented as the owner on the blockchain or whatever other ledger, has certain rights associated with that ownership, which might include the right to produce derivatives, either, and there are like public standards for this. There's like sort of a classic like NFT standard license with several variations. A16Z Crypto has put out a series they call the Can't Be Evil licenses. That in particular look at questions around what happens to license rights that were exercised before the asset is then transferred to somebody else. But so far, this has basically been maintained through specifications and contracts and terms and conditions, right? That sort of form a bridge, crypto pun not intended. I guess it really is a bridge in the sense of crypto between the digital asset and the legal system wherever the parent company is incorporated or wherever the asset is being used. But so to the extent that there's been, sort of enforcement of IP rights in various forms, that operates through the legal system, which has sort of like rules and specifications for it. But again, new types of IP rights and new types of IP frameworks are being evolved for digital assets in real time. So subject to change and lots of exciting stuff happening here.
Yeah, the one thing I would bolt on top of that is, you know,
Sorry, I gave the I am not a lawyer, but here's what I understand in the high level answer.
Yeah,
Steve's
you're
gonna
like-
actually give something practical.
you're like, not financial advice, but no, like it's the you know, it's totally fair. And it's like, it's funny, whenever we talk about IP rights on my show, what we do is we bring up, you know, or copyright law. You know, there's a couple of tremendous lawyers I know who will come up to stage, and I will kick
Right.
it to them, because I'm always like, y'all like literally are doing this. Because it's funny, one thing about copyright and IP that's very interesting, and why I appreciate Scott's diligence there, is that when you start talking about it in like an X space, everyone becomes an expert on copyright and IP, and nobody actually understands it, right? The thing that I'll say that's like built on top of it, that's the interesting question that I've seen, you know, challenge, which, you know, I think we have an answer to, but I won't espouse to know for sure, is that, or claim to know for sure, is that the idea that you have a digital token, and by all accounts and purposes, you own a digital token, right? So do you really have associated rights to the images attached, or is it the token that you own? And that's the challenge I've seen from various people. So there are these fundamental questions that are really interesting with new technologies that I see, which is like, you know, oh, well, you own a Bored Ape Yacht Club 9976. Do you just own the token pointer on the Ethereum blockchain, or do you own the image itself? And I think that those questions, like watching them play through, is really interesting. And I think the early returns, don't quote me on this, are that, you know, it seems that yes, you do own the image itself because that's what the company has issued you. But that was like a real challenge people had of saying, what do you really own when you own an NFT? You own a data pointer, particularly if it's not on chain. And so those questions have come up before. And it's one of those areas where, you know, similar to Scott, I'll say, I'm not an expert, and I just try to talk to people who are. But it's one of my favorite areas to actually have conversations with those lawyers on, because they're really paving, like, I love innovative stuff. Like, the reason I like new tech is I love stuff that's new. Like, I like the fact I had a friendly debate with like a friend of mine, a guy, Sam Gelman, who goes by NFT Stats on X, who's like a pretty well-known guy in the industry. Like, we talked on the phone for about an hour and a half, and we have a fundamental disagreement on a couple things related to NFTs. Neither of us were like upset or saying the other one was wrong, but the good part is we ended the phone call saying, guess what? We get to see how it plays out, and we're going to find out. And so that part to me is really fun. And that's one of the reasons I love talking to sort of the copyright, you know, copyright lawyers and people like that, because like, I get to like watch them actually form this new area that doesn't exist. And it's like, there's so many questions. And like the digital verse token is an example of one I never even conceptualized until I had a copyright lawyer on my stage say, well, wait a minute, like, let's have this conversation about what these IP rights truly are. So I love that about the space, and I wish I knew more. And it's one of those things where I'd like to get educated on. I just don't have the 4 years to go to law school and make sure I am. So it's super good.
Steve, do you have any opinions on what an ideal sort of a copyright regime might look like?
Honestly, like, I don't think so, right? Like, to me, in the ideal world, I suppose, like, I like the idea of having control of my ideal personal. So I'm going to speak in a couple different terms. Like, my ideal personal sort of IP structure is not like, it's dependent on what I want from the brand, actually. Like, I love the fact that like Doodles like takes very seriously that they're building an entire brand around their IP, and therefore like there are limited sort of rights and understanding, but they're building the world for me to work within. But on the other hand, I also love the fact that I can, you know, use my Bored Ape on anything I want, and it's considered okay, like within reason, obviously, but like, because there's technically a line in there that if it's like, you know, there's technically a line that kind of gives you an overarching, you know, hey, if you're doing something super detrimental to the brand, it's bad. But like, and so people have argued that. That's always my funniest argument, is like people arguing that is no different than like, you know, people saying like Dot Swoosh can use your social media thing. So people are like, that's it. Dot Swoosh is going to take your pictures of your kids and put them on Dot Swoosh. Like, no, they just want to use your shoe you unboxed and say, if we do, it would be ideal. So I think like there's different models of it. I don't know that there's an ideal one for me. I think it depends how I participate with the brand, I guess, that makes it, you know, makes it ideal.
Yeah, exactly. I think like sort of the ideal overarching regime is one that allows a lot of flexibility and for brands and to customize according to how they intend to use the digital assets and part of in their sort of broader brand purpose. And as with anything, right? Like, I feel like I said this yesterday too. Like, you know, rules help markets function, right? Like, you know, sort of A common misconception is that a free market is a market with no rules, right? Like, it's very difficult to have a market for intellectual property. In the same way, it's been difficult to have markets for digital assets because, the asset is difficult to define, and the boundaries of it are hard to measure, right? Like, how do you know whether something is or is not like basically the same idea, an idea space? And so, having like a really well-functioning intellectual property system around these sort of like emergent NFTs and other digital assets, I think is really important for being able to leverage that feature of the tech going forward.
Matt, you want to ask your
Matt.
question?
Yeah, so I'm currently looking at this question for like the social media, and you brought up Farcaster about like what needs I'm kind of looking at the question like what needs to be on chain and like the whole privacy versus public debate type of thing, and saying like, oh, does this actual social media message need like the actual physical data need to be represented on chain, even though there's like DMs and all these type of privacy issues. And kind of the first thing that clicked with like NFTs was the gaming, and I saw like I had buddies with CS:GO make a ton of money secondary market, and like obviously there's the use case for CS:GO to want to be able to capture that creator earnings, like that 5 to 10% type of, so they get like for revenue. But like what's stopping going like that public versus private debate for like public versus private blockchains, and like what's stopping Fortnite from just creating that like their own secondary marketplace so then they can still capture that revenue, but then nobody can kind of come from the outside and build on top of it. So there's still that walled gardens, but they're kind of getting those that like secondary marketplace. I'd love to hear your guys' takes on why they should go public instead of kind of creating those like private walled garden blockchain, but still getting a lot of the pros from the actual technology, but allowing the whole decentralized nature to come into it.
I can give a thought on this, but first, can I ask you a question as to what your hat is? Because I love that hat, and I've been staring at it since we got on here.
Thing. Oh my gosh.
It's a Palm golf hat. To be honest, I just Googled cool golfing hats and then was able to find the
you were successful.
brand, but
yeah, you were
definitely
successful.
I was thinking exactly the same thing.
Like since you came on, I've been like, I want that hat.
That's awesome. I got it Monday, so I really appreciate that. I'll have to sing the link in the chat.
Yeah, actually, please do, because I will definitely like. Yeah, I think it's awesome. And my friends, my wife is supportive, but my friends will be like, "Oh, you have non-NFT gear for the first time. That's awesome." Look, I'll give a quick answer, and I'll kind of kick it to Scott. Like, I would say one of the things motivating wise, personally, if I am and again, not a lawyer or anything like that, or a tax attorney, but if I'm Fortnite, I don't want to be issuing tax forms to 12-year-olds. So the idea of having an open sort of source blockchain means that like somebody else can actually sell it on the secondary market. I can win by getting my royalty from that market that enforces those royalties, but I don't have to be the one who's issuing the marketplace. Because right now, my kids and they, they're constantly trading things on Roblox. My daughter is just slaying Roblox pets from Pet Simulator X or Pet Simulator 99 as it is now all day, right? But like, she's trading for in-game currency, she's trading things on the platform, and that's wonderful. But like the revenue stream of trading outside of it, and by the way, I don't think that goes away. No different than, a trading platform in-game for sort of in-game, currency that matters could be great. But like the idea that you could trade off-chain, or the idea that you can convert money off-chain onto on-chain in that way is like, to me, I should say off-platform, not off-chain. Off-platform means that they don't need to issue tax forms or worry about all the legalities around that, and they are passing off the potential responsibility. And if I'm a brand, I heard the CEO of Roblox mention in a CNBC interview as a just throwaway comment, like, hey, like it's the dream to have NFTs. Like they mentioned NFTs being the dream because then you have, this digital ownership. But I think part of what would stop you is getting yourself into all the troubles of building it. In fact, seeing like brands, like one of, I think the barriers for brands is all of the tremendous legal regulatory issues they're navigating. Like there are things that I've seen brands like Starbucks and Nike and others that are big coming in the space that I can't talk about for confidentiality reasons, do things in a specific way because they know the legality or the regulatory or the issues that might go into it, that they're very smart and very savvy about, right? And I think like those brands are very savvy and smart in what they're doing, but like not every brand is going to want to go up that hill and be constantly thinking about that. So I think that is a very compelling reason to say, we want these outside the platform so somebody can buy or sell this individual item, instead of being on platform for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe just adding one footnote to that, I think also as, sort of if this Web3 model really takes off and becomes a core part of our experience of the internet, right? What do we say? We're competing for digital wallet share, right? Like if people have single user accounts that they're carrying around with them on the internet, you actually, as a brand, really want to be in that account, right? You actually want to be part of the identity that someone's representing everywhere. And so, and I think, to be clear, there's going to be lots of walled garden building, like, sort of as well, right? Like, I don't think it, and some things will pass out through the membrane, some things won't, like, or some platforms will just like, look, we're a closed shop, that's how we run. But like, I think fundamentally, like, Web3 has this driver towards interoperability. And the fact that there is, there are these, interoperable, like, sort of tech standards that enable people to spin up on them very quickly. Like what Steve was just talking about, it's like, if you are Nike, maybe you want to have, I have no specific knowledge of this, like, but maybe Nike has, sort of thought for years about, like, digital collectibles in different forms, or like, but the infrastructure is hard, right? Like, you don't necessarily, like, one does not necessarily, like, as a business, want to be in the business of building digital collectible infrastructure. Whereas, unless that's actually like your principal business, right? Like, and even if you're a game, right? Like, maybe you do want to be in the business of building infrastructure, like your Pokemon Go, you like, sort of want to give people access to, or you want to build systems for collecting and trading Pokemon. But like, even so, how do you think about, like, if you want to enable people to showcase those Pokemon elsewhere, maybe that's not your business, right? And are you going to, like, go through the trouble of constructing the API and, like, managing the process for, like, Pokemon, like, visibility on Instagram or something of the sort? Or is it better to just be building on the infrastructure that people's, like, personal accounts are already attached to? And so I think there's going to be a natural flow in that direction as well.
So, Scott, you touched on how infrastructure is hard. And one of the questions that I had as I read this book is, how far away are we from having some of the infrastructure that's really necessary to unlock the true power of NFTs? So, like, transaction costs is one area, having greater control and security over what data you share, that's another thing. Seamless transaction reversals. So I'm curious for both of your takes on, like, where we're at, what you think needs to happen first, and who you think is actually going to drive innovation in this space.
Great. So again, no crystal ball, and these sorts of things are very, very hard to estimate, because they, they rely on estimating, like, sort of like future development, sort of speed of development of technology that's in, like, relatively nascent to, like, mid stages right now. But certainly, I mean, we're already seeing, innovations with layer 2s on Ethereum or other blockchains that are just, in one fashion or another, higher throughput. So we're seeing innovation that's bringing transaction costs down. Again, still not yet to to, like, Visa, MasterCard, like, daily transaction throughput scale, much less all the interactions people ever do with online goods, scale. But good enough to, like, play games and sort of have interactions with, with various, like, sort of high intensity, like, online activities. So that sort of innovation, I think, is happening very much, sort of in real time right now. And the difference is, the experiential difference is already massive, right? Like, as somebody, Steve and I both like to collect NFTs of various forms, and, like, the experience of collecting an NFT on an L2 versus collecting an NFT on Ethereum mainnet is just, like, fundamentally different, right? Like, you can go and get a thing that's like a, a $2, like, sort of effectively you're, like, minting something as a like, or just sort of like almost like a tip to a creator, but also through a show of affiliation. And, like, and the transaction fee is a penny, and that sort of feels like a very reasonable transaction fee to pay on a $2 charge. Whereas if instead you were trying to print something that, that's nominally free, but has a $35 transaction fee because the network is gummed up this hour, much, like, harder as a consumer value proposition. So that sort of innovation is happening in real time. And I think we're also starting to see better custodial wallets, better account recovery solutions. Again, I'm not a cryptographer, but my understanding from my cryptographer friends is that we're even starting to see better, account recovery for self-custody, but even more, sort of custodial wallet solutions with, that are designed to be consumer friendly and feel like ordinary consumer internet products are becoming a thing. And so I think all of that is very powerful. But also, and perhaps, arguably even more importantly, right, it's like to me at least, it's and by the way, if you look right, like like the dot swoosh, Starbucks Odyssey, like these early like big brand applications have a custodial frame option, even if at least with Odyssey you can take them off platform to your self custody wallet, right? Like part of it is the brands have pushed technology that makes them more tractable and accessible to the consumer. I think that is what's going to drive a lot of it, right? Like sort of the first time you need to acquire an NFT ticket, an NF ticket in order to attend an event. Now you're going to set up a wallet with whatever the associated probably custodial wallet provider is. And then you have a wallet that you were talking about earlier that like can be used in sort of all these other application contexts. But the onboard is going to be these things become accessible to the consumer and then become embedded in an ordinary consumer application that causes people to need to do it for whatever reason.
I'll just
Steve,
build
go
on that. I'll build on it and oversimplify the answer. Like to me, it's a combination of like, I mean, the really simple answer is when Apple and Android get interested, because half the world accesses the internet via mobile phone. So when there's a wallet, just the same way that I used to have to go through Delta app to get on my plane, and now I put it in my wallet with my tickets to the Kane Brown concert, that and everything else in between, right? And so to me, like that functionality of like, oh, okay, I have everything sort of in one location is interesting to me. But I honestly think, even backing it up, I think the more there are secure mobile options, not just web apps, but like, when Nike.swoosh is a web app, when Starbucks Odyssey isn't just a web app, but is actually in a native app on your phone, I think that's when we see this thing really start to tip and be better. Like, because all the other problems, I think, we have layer 2s and scalability solutions people will work out. And over time, those will continue to like, build out. Gaming is getting better. And, I ask people like, Scott and I have a particular game that we're a fan of called Pirate Nation. Love the game. Super enjoyable. I should be selling my pirates for what those costs are right now, but I like the game too much. So I'm keeping on to them, right? And it's like, with that, it's like, the question I always ask the team is, when mobile? Because my kids like it. My son asks when he can play it. And it's like, well, when we can put it on a mobile platform and I can log them in. Or like, there are games that my kids would grind for me, frankly, that have actual financial outcomes that like they can't do because I can't throw it on a mobile or throw it on their phone. And again, it's not about the financial aspect of it as much as it about the accessibility of me being able to say, oh, okay, like, I'm sitting at the doctor's office, I can play Pirate Nation, right? Like that sort of thing is what matters to me. So I think the mobile adoption to me, whatever that looks like, which is a very oversimplified answer that has a ton of complex other domino problems that fall from that, is when we start to see it really move, because I just think everybody's accessing through a 6-inch screen right now. And I think that that's where we're going to see it. So when Apple and Android get interested, when mobile apps become a thing that can work for people that way, like that's when we start to see this thing really start to tip. And ticketing applications, right? It's like we talked about ticketing applications, all that kind of hinges on a mobile phone. So that's sort of where I see it ultimately.
You're not gonna bring your desktop to a sporting event, or when you get a printout, you've now lost the core functionality, right? You're no longer using a digital asset to verify entry. Totally.
Right. Like, hold on, let me get my MetaMask logged in. Oops, I forgot it. Let me put my 20th word seed phrase in it. Oh, I forgot my ledger. Oh, here we go. And then you're bringing in your laptop. No, it's you want to go in, scan, you own the thing. So that's my inclination.
Yeah, a friend of mine is building out the technology that actually backs the California state driver's license. They're
awesome.
It's like a mobile app now, and going back to an earlier point that like a possible future is that we will be using NFTs in some way without actually realizing it. Right now, if you have the California state ID app installed, you actually have a public key, which could theoretically then be like, right, like used for other purposes.
Awesome.
Yep. So it's like, yeah, I think there's this path that the technology just kind of like eases in, and we don't see like any kind of like a clear sort of adoption point, right?
Yep.
I'm a big fan of your friend. Like I love hearing that. Like that's because like one of the things as a side note, sorry, like as it sparked a thought is like one of the things that Scott and I tried to make sure we had throughout the book is what we called the boring examples, right? Which we didn't mean they were truly boring, but like, credentials don't sound very as sexy as, expensive monkey pictures on paper with Snoop Dogg concerts, right? They just don't, right? Or like,
it's really hard to make the DMV as cool sounding as Snoop Dogg. That is true.
So it's like, it's like, to me, it's like when I hear a story like that, it fills my heart with joy. It warms the cockles of my heart, because I'm sitting here saying, oh, like your friend is working on the fundamental technology that'll then go to credentials like work and other things like that, which are the least fun. Like nobody, like we have a long example of medical records. we think it's super exciting. But when I explain medical records applications to people, they start to get their eyes glazing over and they say like, right, but how much was the monkey when you bought it and how much is it worth now? And it's like, that's when we need to get to like what you're saying is exactly what your friend is working on. So sorry, that gets me all fired. It's weird to say I get all fired up about driver's licenses, but I do. I think that's really cool.
Absolutely. 100%.
Matt, do you have a question?
That actually was exactly what I was going to go into. Like, I think it's ridiculous that my social security number is like a piece of paper, or we're probably in some random CSV and like a DMV somewhere. And like, I was just going into like the whole like actual like identity side of things, like the government. Like, I hope the first house I buy is the deed is on chain somewhere. And so that's right up to where I was going to ask about like what you guys thought of the whole like real use cases that these things can do that aren't the boring or not the exciting pictures that you get to sell, but like the actual use cases.
Can I give like a fun one that's like kind of boring but kind of not? Is like, you know, like one that I really like is the idea of car sales. And I know this, like, I am the worst person at buying a car because I go in and they're like, hey, I want to buy this car. They're like, you need the unicorn wheels. I'm like, I need the unicorn wheels at $10,000. Let's go. Because I'm the sucker who like goes to the car dealership and overpays for everything, right? Imagine an on-chain world where I could see like the last sale, the previous sale, what every make and model of that used car sells for. And then imagine a world, and again, it's way far in the future. Yeah. So, but it's like, imagine a world where that transaction has a baked in, you know, sort of like I'm signing certain documents. Those documents for the car is delivered to my house and it's baked into the sale price. So it just shows up at my house. And like, that's a very futuristic world. We have a lot to do. We don't even have, you know, car titles on chain yet. We have a lot of ways to go before we get that. But like, to me, those opportunities, at least, and maybe it doesn't change the full in-person action. Like, it's not all going to be Jetsons right away, but like those sort of things to me, you know, make the consumer be a little more empowered to buy a car. For me, certainly being able to like know I'm getting a good deal. Which is a side note. There's a book by a guy named Bruce Blaine and Davis Skeeta called The Predictioneer's Game, where he talks about the way he buys a car, which is quite interesting. Where he basically calls up these car dealerships and says, "I need your lowest price," and I'm calling every single car dealership. And if you don't give me your lowest price, I'll go to the next one. And, you know, I'm going in with one check, so don't try to upsell me. And they're like, you can't buy a car like this. He ends up getting the best deals. I don't have the sort of metal to make those calls and deal with the car dealership. I feel bad for them. So like that idea is really exciting to me. And it's like, but even on a simple factor, the idea of having your sort of car title on chain and maybe having an associated token to prove you own it is interesting, because then again, then you get into the fun stuff where it's like, okay, Jeep owners love their Jeep. Well, I'm a Jeep owner who wants to soup up my Jeep in, you know, Atlanta, Georgia, and I want to talk to somebody who's in, you know, Portland, Oregon, who also is doing that. You can go through a message board where there's all these conversations that are not really in particular about, you know, it's only about the Jeeps, or I can have a two-way interaction in a digital space that says, I own a green Jeep that I'm souping up. They own a green Jeep they're souping up. We can trade ideas about that and become friends across the country. Like, so the brand building can happen on top of it. And so that's what I think is funny is the mundane things like block parties are easier when you have licenses on chain and all these different things that you can apply on them. So like, to me, like that's one that's super interesting to me. And there's, I think anything credentials sounds boring, but can actually quickly become a way for people to build brands in a new and meaningful way. And of course that can apply to voter records, right? Like, which whole down the line story, it has to be tested and things like that. But if you can prove you live somewhere and you get one vote and it's on chain, like, you know, obviously private, you know, because it's a vote, like there's so many different ways you can picture where this thing goes.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Basically, like I mentioned earlier this idea about like sort of an AI like identity verification, right? And like these credentials actually, I think, make one of the strongest cases for why this stuff has to be interoperable and has to be user controlled, right? In the same way that you need to be able to like, you know, show your driver's license and ID at a random selection of things without, you know, without the DMV being able to like pre-plan where it is you're going to show your driver's license. Or similarly, like you might need to enter your social security number onto lots of different categories of tax forms with different employers or sort of, you know, places that are hiring you as a contractor or whatever. Like, these have to be able to evolve and morph their uses as the different applications evolve and change, and as you sort of like interact with different types of businesses and business contexts. And so fundamentally, it has to be interoperable, right? It's not good enough for there to be like a database with an API for checking your sort of for like verifying your driver's license. It has to be like, that's why we have a physical card, because you have to be able to present it to someone who may not have been able to set up like a connection to that database. And then the user control, you also need to be able to present your driver's license in a context where or your proof of ownership for something frequently in a context where the original verifying database is not directly accessible, or maybe doesn't even exist, right? Like, if you bought a car and, I guess cars are registered with the government as well, but like if you bought if you buy, maybe like a bike or a motorcycle and you want to prove your identity that you're the owner of it, but the dealership that sold it to you has gone out of business, that might actually be very difficult. You probably didn't like save the receipt. Sorry, I don't own a motorcycle. I don't know whether a motorcycle has this like registered title as well. But bear with me for the hypothetical. You don't have a receipt. You don't necessarily have a way to like prove that you are the owner if the database that registered you as the owner ceases to exist. And yet you very much might need to do that. And so for all of these reasons, I think these credential applications, they're mundane in some sense, but they're actually like really critical applications for exactly this type of infrastructure.
Yeah, that point reminds me actually of the, just the early history of computer networks. The networking protocols, companies really tried very hard to keep those things proprietary, right? Like they saw it as like,
Absolutely.
this is like how we're going to make money, right? And then and then a group of people came by and said, no, we should actually standardize and keep open like the way in which computers talk to each other. And then from there, of course, like this very large kind of like ecosystem of stuff like gets built on. But like they're I don't like fully have like the analogy of like this history in my head. Like there seems to be like there has to be an incentive to like make the things open. In the case of early network history, it was like I think people were making it open really more on like a kind of like a principle, like information must be free, kind of a philosophy, right? Less so of like this is actually economically going to be better for the world. I'm not sure like something like that quite exists like in the NFT and the crypto space, but yeah.
I mean, I think my hope is that that the loop does close. And again, if you think about like the amount of value that those computer networks have created, right? Even if they were originally opened on principle, it is assuredly the case that the fact that these standards are open and that like, sort of networking is like broadly accessible to like new entrants is the thing that drives most of the value to computing today, right? And so, I don't have a strong stance on like what sort of what drives people, whether it's principle or sort of economic incentive or what. But I think we are seeing, sort of even in these early experiments, like some digital brands that are being built very successfully, like in the open for all to see. We're seeing games experiment with interoperable assets and like sort of, on-chain games that other people can plug into and optimize on, and even, use their game assets and, sort of cross-platform. We're even starting to see bits of that. And again, it's early days. So we don't know exactly which of these business models are the best and which ones can succeed and which ones like, might succeed for a while, but not be sustainable in the very long run. But I do really believe that there's a potential for this to be sort of better for everyone. And this, like we were talking about earlier, was like growing the pie metaphor. Like, when you have, in the same sense that like, you're much more incentivized to renovate your house, like improve the kitchen or whatever, if you own the house than if you're renting it. On an internet where everyone is an owner, I think there's a strong incentive for people to engage and create value in their internet experiences in a way that drives value to the platforms as well.
I'm curious what you think of this idea. Like I sometimes think that the application of a lot of like things like NFTs, like things that are built on the blockchain, really need like don't really need the blockchain technology, but need the energy and the excitement to like create standards around it, right? It's like the important thing right for NFTs, I think, is that somebody was like motivated enough to like write the EIP spec, right? And that there was a whole community of people who adopted that. But like whether or not like the actual chain is maintained in like a decentralized, like trustless way, or by, let's say, a nonprofit entity that just maintains like like a single database, right? Like that kind of backing technology is like technically not important. But the excitement around the decentralized stuff sort of helps in the standardization process, right? Like how much of the value here do you think actually comes from decentralization versus the standards?
I have an opinion that, like, to me, I think, I don't know, this is sort of like taking it a different direction. I I think the excitement around, I think one of the things that drives the innovation is the opportunity early on that you see from it, where maybe you don't need an NFT specifically for a thing, but then you figure out ways, like, inherently, owning the image is cool, and what you build on top of it and using the technology for that is cool. But like, there are a lot of things I'll see like in certain Web3 projects where people are like, do you really need NFTs for this? But to your point, I think the incentive structures that go along with it often end up driving that and often lead to different types of innovations. Like, inherently, I suppose, Bored Ape Yacht Club could have been issued as a, image that you have, and they just trust me, you own it. Like, and the digital record is obviously important, but along the way, like, things like using a fungible token to actually sell into merchandise, which then ultimately lead to other innovations down the line where people do the same thing, is an innovation that maybe comes as a result of it. It's probably not the best example because I think they could be, but I do think that there's incentive structures that exist that, like, particularly financial ones early on, that motivate people to maybe use the blockchain. And someone might say, why do you need an NFT for this? But it can lead to further innovation down the road as they build on top of it. So I think, like, I don't know, like, I don't know if that's an answer to the question necessarily, because I do think that, like, there are certain things, but I also think it's like figuring out, like, maybe someone tries it because they think it's interesting and then realize, oh, we could use a database for this. And it's not necessarily the same thing versus, like, if you're building around it, which is sort of the purpose that comes from the blockchain. I don't know. I don't know, Scott, if you have thoughts on that, but it's actually a really good question. I probably need to ponder more.
No, it's a great question. And I think, like our answer on, like, sort of what's the right intellectual property regime, I think it depends a lot on the, like, business context and the specific structure of the asset, right? Like, I don't even think fundamentally the concept of an NFT is, like, limited to blockchain-based NFTs. And we're much less public blockchain-based NFTs, right? We sort of, and we're very careful in the book to say, like, NFTs on public blockchains have the following properties because, NFT is like a record of ownership in a database, and those databases can be secured in many different ways, and they can be more or less public and more or less decentralized. That said, I think, and indeed, right, like, sort of there are NFT applications that in effect, like, many people access exclusively through custodial platforms where the platform is, like, managing everything under the hood, or like when you trade on Coinbase or something of the sort, right? Like, an exchange is often managing trading sort of on its own sort of back end ledger and, like, only settling to, the blockchain or whatever other ledger, like, periodically. And yet for the average user, that's like, that's sufficient, right? Like, if you're on an exchange, like, so long as the exchange is, managing everything in a way that is secure and complete and properly sort of monitored and so forth, like, you as a user are often not concerned with whether, the transaction is settled on the blockchain instantaneously or whether a lot of the trading is internal and then just sort of every so often the thing is, and again, every so often here could mean, like, every millisecond, right? It's not like, it's not like, every 2 weeks or whatever, they make sure that everything's sort of, the books check out. But like the instantaneity is not actually sort of a part of the average user concern. That said, I do think, NFTs on public blockchains offer a number of fundamental functions that are difficult to do with even, like, a slightly less decentralized architecture. And one of them is just the ability to have, like, public commitment to functionality, right? So, like, the idea of a smart contract that you can write a piece of software that is immutable and will, like, continue to work that way sort of so long as the blockchain continues to exist, I think it's very fundamental for a lot of NFT applications, right? Like, if you're going to instantiate a digital asset, the buyer of that or the acquirer of that digital asset wants, like, for many types of transactions, needs to be confident that the asset will continue to work as designed, right? Even the simple functionality of just, like, I can transfer it to Steve if it's transferable, or I can, like, reference it and prove ownership, right? Like, that simple functionality as governed by immutable code is important. And certainly things built on top of that then are as well, right? Like, if I'm going to embed the functionality that, like, this asset accrues rewards if you use it in certain ways, like, maybe that makes perfect sense to happen off chain. But if you want to, make those, sort of make that reward system, sort of immutable, right? Like, think about it, the last time, like, Marriott or United or whatever, sort of devalued their points relative to their ecosystem, right? Like, if you want to make the structure of a reward immutable, having it in committed code and committed and auditable code is very important. And then for a lot of this like third-party value creation, again, I think the existence on like a public ledger is very important. As you say, it could be a public standard that is not necessarily decentralized. And indeed, blockchains establish security. Like a blockchain is one particular form of distributed ledger, but like they sketch out wide swaths from, mostly permissioned to totally permissionless in terms of like the underlying security model. And so even like if you're on a public blockchain standard, it's not necessarily like, as decentralized as some of the most decentralized blockchains. And like, that just depends on the application context and like how much you care about that level of sort of like extreme sort of security and the costs that come with it versus, some degree, sort of public access and like sort of like public commitment to a standard can work in many cases, right? Like when sort of institutions are strong, sort of public access, public commitments have some degree of weight and power. So I think it's a spectrum. But I do think that like both the decentralized aspect of public blockchains and the public aspect of public blockchains like create sources of value for NFTs that are hard to do without those features.
Scott, you said something before like the value of the network accrues to the assets, to the tokens.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep.
So-
Network effects accrue to the asset. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the potential distributional aspects of this. Like like if is this a thing where the wealthy will just get wealthier? You can think of like an airdrop as like being some form of like a UBI. So like I imagine that people are some people are like concerned about this. They're like trying to come up with sort of NFT native solutions. Like, do you have any thoughts on this?
Super interesting. Let me make sure I understand the question because there are many different things you could mean by wealthy in this context. So by wealthy, do you literally mean like, wealthy in the sense of financial wealth and sort of like socioeconomic inequality? Or do you mean wealthy in the sense of platform wealth? Sort of like the strong network effects in the end get stronger?
I was thinking more of more financial wealth, right? It's like if the assets are going up in value, then only people who have money can actually afford the assets. But you would ideally like some more progressive, right?
So this is a very good and very important question. And again, I mean, sort of the current state. It's important to think of sort of the current state of crypto and the associated sort of blockchain-based asset markets as, at least in my view, like pretty far out of sort of long-run equilibrium. Like certainly, but one of the challenges, and this is true across technology, this isn't just Web3 specific, but and to be clear, out of equilibrium on this dimension, but like, technology skews, affluent, and often white, often male, like, and Web3 in many ways even more so because in many contexts, like sort of both the technical hurdle to getting into it in the first place has been very high historically, right? Like it's sort of, you're running at the rails on the sort of the rails of this alternate internet, or you're sort of like layer of the internet. And so you need a lot of technical savvy to participate in it. And, even just like in terms of raw transaction fees, right? Like the costs have been high and like very volatile over time and so forth. And so, it skews, even further on the edge, sort of on the socioeconomic spectrum, at least sort of, and yet at the same time, like one of the primary applications that people talk about, and I really do believe this, is that, having a decentralized transaction infrastructure layer for the internet brings with it the potential of like much broader financial inclusion, right? Like much broader access for people who don't have access to secure, sort of transaction infrastructure, wherever they are in the world. And so there is this funny tension, right? Like on the one hand, like, sort of a lot of the early experimentation and use has been from people who have the resources and the technological know-how to gain access to it. And a lot of the benefits, sort of especially sort of the to the extent that a lot of the activity has been over financialized, right? Like, a lot of that's meant a lot of sophisticated agents and a lot even relatively unsophisticated actors, but who had the wealth to start participating, like then ended up receiving lots of airdrops and so forth. And maybe that accrued further value. But again, like the real potential for the technology, I think, is much more about enabling access for many people more broadly. And in so doing, right, like by removing intermediation and removing barriers to participation, I think it has the potential to like sort of overall be like a leveling technology, right? And if you think again about, there's sort of like beginnings of that sort of starting to appear, not just, first of all, like sort of parts of development finance that are now running on blockchain rails and so forth. But even like, even in the high end part of the NFT market, right, you're seeing creators who had no access to the ability to like sell their work previously. They sort of weren't the type, they weren't, they didn't have access to the gallery system if they were artists. They didn't have access to, sort of like the broader parts of, sort of like the high end parts of YouTube and so forth. But they were able to start, in a intermediary free way, like directly connect with an audience and like build an audience sort of in Web3, using the technology, which is just like out there and accessible. So I think there's like real potential over time for this to be actually like a broad like leveling agent sort of for our experience of the internet. And to like, again, if we shape it in the right way and make sure to enable access, make it something that can bring many, many more people in and give them the opportunity to like flourish and prosper. But the point you raise is very, very well taken, right? Like if you think about if people are accruing reputation even, right? It's just like, an experience and all these things, like the people who've been in the system in many ways have a head start, right? You've got all of your on-chain attestations that you did cool stuff. You've got like your like I was there badge. You're going to have your POAP from this session to prove that you attended like an early salon conversation on the future of NFTs. Like all of that reputation, like is going to sort of give you a position out in front as new people are coming in. And so as we broaden access to Web3, I think it's incredibly important for us to think about how you enable new people to come in and form reputations and gain participation so that it isn't just, sort of the people out in front running faster and faster and faster.
I'll verbally retweet everything Scott just said, but I'll add on to it. I'll make it a quote tweet and just build on that to say like, and this is obviously very sort of, corny to some people, but I'm a big believer in being the change you want to see. Like diversity inclusion initiatives are something I worked very strongly on at Progressive when I was in recruitment marketing, because unconscious bias exists across the board and you want to figure out ways to reduce that so you can have the best possible sort of workforce to be representative of the population. And I think very similar in Web3, like the best I can say about it, like, is that it is a real problem. It is a conversation we need to continue to have. And, we just do our best to sort of, platform the people who are trying to, fight that front and center. And, indeed, there are some really good people who are working on that. And so I think like for us, looking at those who are speaking out and giving them the opportunity to, we've done, and unfortunately to your point, like, I'll do a morning show and we'll include, creators from groups that are traditionally not, marginalized or not necessarily given that, headway. And those don't necessarily do as well as the, let's talk about the upcoming airdrop. So you're right that there is a real problem that exists there. But I think the best we can do is say we needed to, like, it was important to us to acknowledge that in the book as a challenge. And, I think a lot of people get uncomfortable with that conversation, but I think it's an important conversation to continue to have. So I think it's just one that, being the change we want to see is what we can do from our position that we've, been put in here. And outside of that, it's a matter of like realizing the technology can uniquely enable the ability for people to do that. So that's something I think that we're both passionate and interested in continuing to push forward.
So as we head towards the end of our time here, I wanted to open up the floor for anyone who has any remaining questions or comments.
If I have a question, I'll ask. I guess the title of the book, the Everything Token, and I haven't read the book, but I've ordered it as well, so I'll know myself in a few weeks. But I'm kind of curious your prediction for what use cases, where is that Everything Token most likely to really make an impact? Is it the Ticketmaster kind of ticketing kind of application? Is it payments? What are the use cases where you see? We talk a lot about collectibles on this call. I get that piece, but I'm trying to figure out where are the real use cases that you see this making a bigger impact and that will put it NFTs more on the map. So
I'll hit the three that like and not to be like too redundant on it, but like I think the ticketing that you mentioned absolutely ticketing is my favorite use case because it's just turning a ticket into a flexible brand asset is like the biggest no-brainer to me for everybody involved. Like the same way that like when a sports team is good, it kind of helps the surrounding area, right? Like there is a actual economic impact to LeBron James being in Cleveland. Similarly, having these assets be something that you can build on top of has an actual impact on all of the businesses the players themselves, the team themselves, and everybody else. So ticketing's interesting to me. The broad sweeping credentialing idea, like the less sexy idea of, things like, what Wes's friend is working on, like that is really interesting to me. The credentialing idea. And then, Scott mentioned it briefly earlier. We kind of hit it at a high level, but, we're entering a world where there's a technology called Sora that is coming from OpenAI, and others are working on it, where you can quite literally type in, woman in a black dress walks down the streets of Tokyo is one I saw. And the video was nearly indistinguishable from real life. And this is based on a very simple prompt. And in, basically, 2 to 3 years, we've gone from crude language learning models, or let's just say in 10 years, we've gone from Siri, right, like AI, to crude language learning models to, typing in 5 words and having it pump out a video that is like completely, realistic. So the idea that you could have an official sort of tied account that can like then be officially releasing NFTs on a blockchain to say you can always verify back to the original source to avoid things like deep fakes from, people out in public, like that is such a game-changing technology to me, to have that official source that is blockchain tied, immutably put back, adding at least an extra layer of security and protections there. It's not perfect, right? Someone could still figure out a way to hack the various systems, but it's not as simple as spinning up a deep fake and posting it on Facebook and watching it spread. And I think as that consumer behavior is trained, we'll be able to see that change. So I think those 3 are really interesting sort of non-collectible applications that become something that I think can fundamentally change the way the world is, we approach the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and maybe like riffing off of what Steve just said, I think first of all, there's a big class of applications where this is just like a fundamentally better technology for a type of transaction that's already happening. And like digital tickets are in that category. A lot of these credential interactions are in that category. The AI like verification ID is a generalization or extension of credentials that solves a problem that has never existed before. Or has never existed at scale before. I mean, obviously, like verification of identity has been very important, but like the need to verify identity potentially in every single internet interaction or application, sort of in real time, is a new, at least like newly sort of central social fear with the rise of generative AI. There's also, and I think perhaps, again, and one has to be like wary because everything we think of is skeuomorphic, right? It's like really hard to, it's really hard to come up with an application that's truly outside the scope of what we can imagine or we have variations of today, but almost tautologically. But sort of 2 other like broad categories of applications that I'm personally excited about. One of them, just very simple, like ownership of your data assets. Like, we talked about health records, right? The simplicity of just being able to move your dental records from one provider to another sounds really boring and silly, but is actually like really complicated under today's architectures. And, and on top of that, right, there's a lot of like losses that come from it, right? Like a lot of people, when they switch to a new dentist, they just don't move their old dental records. And like, there's a lot of social loss there because, maybe there's like something important in your dental history that you don't know, but the dentist would be able to spot in the records immediately. And then as we start to move into like eras of personalized medicine and so forth, the same problem, right? That users don't have central control of their medical information and yet, would like to, in order to, power these various forms of like, sort of very individualized, like bespoke medical technologies, right? It's like a lot of places where user ownership of data and interoperability has the potential to unlock tremendous new consumer value from like, categories like, predictive medicine and so forth. And then a second one, we actually, there's this company called IYK, and we used their tech for some special editions of the book. They produce a chip that you can attach to a physical asset. So like, we put them inside the leaf of the book. You could have them like sewn into a hat. They've done, sort of embedded in like a cosmetic. There's a company called Kiki that has done this. And when you tap this chip with an NFC-enabled phone, it lets you mint an NFT to your wallet that is like sort of a digital twin or related like asset. And then if you give the good to somebody else, right, if we hand the book to some other person, they can then tap it and like claim the NFT to themselves. So like a simple instance of like an application of this might be, you could sell a book that comes with an ebook digital copy. So you get the physical and the ebook in a single object. And if you gift the physical book to somebody else, they get the ebook or can take the ebook away from you, right? So you could like, imagine checking out both books in a single asset from the library, or like buying it and then giving both pieces to a friend at the same time. And like on the one hand, first of all, that's just cool, right? Like there's lots of places where our digital and physical lives, like, there's actually friction to making them overlap. Like I frequently, I will admit it, I buy the same book in physical and an ebook because I want to read it in physical at home. But like, when I'm on the go, I want to, the ebook is easier to carry. I've totally done that in my life. But even more importantly, from a business perspective, it gives the brand something that they have wanted forever, and not just for user tracking reasons, but actually because it creates real value for the customer, which is the ability to follow the customer past the point of sale into their experience of the product, right? Like, the relations, if you're reading a book at home, like there's no way to, in physical copy, there's no way for you to like interact or meaningfully like sort of, when you guys, thank you, by the way, those of you who've like bought the book, and we'd love to hear your feedback on it, but like, and please reach out, seriously. But we would just love to know that you've read it, and we'd love to hear it. But like, we have to like create this very high friction interaction to make that possible, right? Like we have to ask you, please reach out. You have to like look us up on Twitter and send it, or our emails and send us a message. Like, wouldn't it be nice if there was a touch point where like the digital connections enabled by the book, right? The network of everything token readers was a network that we could interact with and that people could surface themselves as members of if they wanted to. And that I'm really, really excited about. And I can't wait to see what people build on top of it.
For example, that would be great with textbooks too. Yeah, they're so
Yes.
expensive, and yeah, having ways to interact
Absolutely.
with your faculty and with your professors and classroom. Yeah,
5,000%. Incidentally, actually, it's such a good idea. I'm going to do a version of this for class. One of the earliest affordances this company IYK built around the tokens is that you can basically stream video. Like people can like log into their like IYK platform and get like updated videos. So you could imagine a professor having a textbook that also has like a series of lesson plans that they're constantly adding to in real time that basically lodge in the hands of anybody who has the textbook NFT.
yeah, love it.
Thanks.
Great,
Me too.
thank you.
I'm totally going to do
Thanks.
this.
Anyone else? Cool. So Scott and Steve, now that the book's out, what's next for both of you, and what's the best way to stay connected to your work?
For me, I don't know, like I'm working on the Starbucks Odyssey stuff, continuing to do some consulting work, like I mentioned with the brand Doodles. And look, I mean, Scott and I are going to continue to work together. We're intrinsically tied forever, which I'm so happy about.
In preparation.
Yeah, like a
right
lot of things
now.
we're working on. So I think like we'll be out there. The best way to get in touch with us, for me personally, like I have a bunch of different platforms, but Twitter is the place that I tend to hang out the most because a lot of people in Web3 hang out there. So, it's NFT BARK. You can see it under my, username there, like NFT Bark, BARK. Like I'm on there. I'm really active. I get super excited. If people buy the book and share it, I will always thank them personally. Sometimes it goes under the radar. I apologize if I miss it, but like that's the best place. I think we've thanked thousands of people at this point who have tagged us on there. So at least so at least for me, that's the best way to stay in touch. And I'm just like, to me, it's like I always say, like my goal is just to work with brands, companies, and do work that I think is really fun and interesting. It's not about the money. It's not about the, the glory or anything like that. It's just to get to do really cool stuff. And so to me, that's what I'll continue to look for, is like, what is the consulting thing because I've had brands approach me about consulting. I'm like, that doesn't really seem as interesting, and good luck on that. But it's not like, not that it's not interesting to anybody. To me, it's not. So I'll just try to continue to work on things that I think are really, really fun. And so I'm just going to be bumping around tech for a while and seeing how it goes.
Awesome. Yeah, echoing Steve, like, first of all, like we've been just totally thrilled and like, I don't know, like mind blown by the amount of support we've been getting from people on various social media platforms, especially X and Farcaster, right? Like, it's just wonderful to see people like reading and engaging with the book and enjoying it, and asking questions and like you're sort of like, like thinking critically about it. Like, we've been learning a lot through the dialogue with everyone. So that's been awesome. Including here, right? Like, it's a really great session. Thank you so much. I literally just yesterday, Shai Bernstein and Liang Wu and I wrapped up the first ever teaching of HBS's Building Web3 Businesses elective course. We finished that. Now tons and tons of writing. Again, when you teach an HBS course, especially like in this first running, right, you learn like lots of things. And so, lots of writing, lots of thinking. And Steve and I, as I said, like we have, I think currently 4 articles in different states of draft and like more to come as we're thinking about questions that have come to us since we published the book, things that didn't quite make it in that we wanted to like sort of expand upon and think about. And then, sort of like stuff that's just totally new, right? Like this, if we'd written the book 6 months later, this AI thing would have been front and center, but like when the thing went to press, it wasn't even like in the radar screen. So all of that. And then, yeah, to follow us and hang out, please, like, sort of all manner of social media, especially X and Farcaster for me, website, scottkom.com, and or just write to us. Email address, like first initial, last name at hbs.edu. Any other things? Or just go to everythingtoken.io and there's like a contact form and that goes to both of us. So lots and lots of stuff. We've really enjoyed talking. Please stay in touch and QED.